expert who podcasts wondering whether being on YouTube will actually grow your podcast audience, then this video is for you. In this video, you're going to learn the exact questions to help you decide if it's worth having your podcast on YouTube, the system and process to put your podcast on YouTube the right way, and what content to put on your podcast YouTube channel to drive more traffic to your podcast. If you're an expert looking for the best advice on how to grow your podcast audience, then subscribe to this channel and hit the bell to be notified whenever I post a new video. Deidre Shen, the CEO and co-founder of Capsho, the world's first AI-powered podcast copywriter, and I have helped a ton of experts. Cumulatively, we have banked over $1.6 million in sales through podcasting. I myself did over $200,000 in my first year podcasting because I stumbled upon all of these little known secrets. So let's get into whether your podcast should be on YouTube, and if so, how to do it the right way. Okay, so we are talking about, we're diving into the question of should your podcast be on YouTube? And if so, how? How do we do it without having our main branded channel penalized from generally poor retention rates on podcast videos? So joining me is my co-founder, Bona Rai. Welcome.
Hello, it's good to be here.
Okay, so we are talking about should we be on YouTube? And let's first talk about, and in my intro, I kind of said, yes, you should, right? But let's talk about why.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Why should we be on YouTube? So I know, and I think a lot of people know, that there's a strong SEO capability that YouTube has. Can you dive into a little bit of that with us?
Yeah, so like you mentioned in the previous section, YouTube is the second largest search engine owned by the largest search engine. So they just own search. Yeah. But there is a very specific, I'm a big Googler, like we say, we just Google everything. But there is a very specific kind of almost culture that's, about YouTube searches. So you will find that, when you're Googling things, if you'll actually get a lot of YouTube responses as well. So it's very important that when you are thinking about the context in which your person is looking for things, that there is a very specific reason that they go to YouTube as well.
Yes.
And that is why you do want to, like you said, if you can, when you have the time and capacity, and after you've created it from using Capsho, that you actually think about how do you actually work on the YouTube specific SEO as well. It's not just, because SEO isn't a monolith where you're just like, yep, I just want to be searchable.
Yes.
Being searchable and visible on YouTube is actually slightly different to being visible and searchable on Google.
Right.
So that's what you want to think about. And there are tools and processes obviously that are specific to YouTube.
Yes.
And that we follow and actually we see results on as well. So it is important for you to understand the difference between the two engines.
Okay, cool. So given that, so we kind of know, yes, we should be on YouTube, again, if we have the time. So that's the first thing, because there's such powerful search capability that goes along with that. So and if we want, which we should, have our podcast be visible to more people, then mastering SEO in some form is one of the ways to do that.
Yes.
So if we're like, okay, we've made the decision, we're going to put our podcast on YouTube. Now, the next question comes about, how do we do that without actually penalizing if we have a branded account? So for me, for example, I have my Deidre Shen Capsho account that I do a lot of much more tighter how-tos.
Yes.
And then, and I'm like, when I was thinking about it, and I was like, okay, do I want to put these full podcast episodes on that YouTube, which are just most likely going to be an audiogram of some form? No one really wants to watch that. What do I do in that instance, right? Like, how do I want to be putting those onto my Deidre Shen Capsho account, or do I do something else? And so when we were talking to some other people, it sort of became obvious, and I was like, oh, okay, that seems
when
to
you
be
say it like that.
Yeah, exactly. That we can just create a separate account for it, so it gets our podcast and the content visible. Now, people may not listen to the whole thing, but at least, again, everything's about visibility, right? They know that we exist, and they've hopefully, either followed us, subscribed on their listening platform, which means that the next time that they want to listen to a podcast, we show up.
Yes.
So let's talk about that. How do we how do we think about creating that separate account?
Yeah, so I guess the great thing is YouTube makes it very simple. Like you said, you just provide the most compelling reason why to do that, and it's because so that your existing account doesn't get penalized. And even if you don't have one yet, that might be something that you want to create in the future. So it's worth just having that and having a separate account for your podcast. And really, it's very simple. You do create. It is important that it is branded because so that people actually realize this is a podcast that they're listening to. If you think about a parallel, another group of people that do this really well are people who have meditations or other forms of audio content, where again, the video itself is just a little moving thing, nothing too crazy, but then it's just almost like a lead gen thing to say, okay, you've stumbled upon meditation music to fall asleep. Now, if you click here, you can actually get access to a lot more on my app or whatever it is. So similarly with podcasts, where going in, there is a branded view of, okay, this is a podcast channel hosted by a person. And so we write our descriptions from your perspective as the host of the podcast, but it's very obvious that it's a podcast channel and people can just maybe listen to one of the playlists or one of the episodes, get a sense of it. But it's really quarantined and separate from the Deidre Shen Capsho account. But I can see that it is run by Deidre Shen. This is a podcast that's hosted by Deidre. So I do get a sense of, it's not just a random video.
Yes.
So your channel is branded. You do talk about, what the podcast is about. We have a photo of you on the banner and all that kind of stuff. But it's very obvious to them that what I get here is full podcast episodes. And you know what? I should just go and listen on my favorite podcast player app.
Okay, cool. Before we get into almost the third thing, which is what to do, the actual content to have on your account versus your podcast account, talk us through almost, because you're the team copywriter, so you do all the descriptions, etc. for YouTube. So what is almost the difference? And where I'm going with this question as well is, how can Capsho help with making that process of writing YouTube descriptions a lot simpler and easier? So what's the difference between, say, the podcast player description, the show notes, and the YouTube description?
Podcast player description, show notes, and YouTube description.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Well, YouTube description should be on our product roadmap.
Yeah.
I do this as a manual step. So the process that we follow for our YouTube episode descriptions is we get the draft from Capsho, because it does a lot of that copywriting for us. Obviously, it's written more from a place of a podcast player description, which is how do you just really hook this person where they're just, oh gosh, this sounds really, really exciting. So that's always a really good place to start because people are still scrolling on YouTube, likely. So what we do on top of that is we say, okay, that's interesting. That's what Capsho is telling me based on what Deidre spoke about in this episode, that the key topic is. And then what our team does is then they take they do some SEO research, some keyword research and validation for YouTube. So that's why I don't want to go into too much crazy detail, but we're looking to say, okay, well, this particular episode is meant to be about episode titles. And this is what Deidre spoke about. We know that from what Capsho has created for us. Now let's look at what people are searching on YouTube for when it comes to episode titles. And lo and behold, it's not always what we think it's going to be, because the YouTube audience is slightly different. So then what I do is, so the team thankfully do this legwork for us, but they so Bonnet, these are the keywords that for YouTube are ranking really well. And actually there's a really great tool called TubeBuddy, which I'll drop a link to in the resources here. And it will show you kind of how you can watch most easily optimizable as well, because it's not just the ones that people are looking for, but where do you have the best chance. So then I'll look at that and say, okay, well, now we can just tweak some of the descriptions. And I'll put a couple of examples in where I've made some changes, just so that it's likely to be surfaced up for a YouTube audience who are looking for that specific thing, if that makes sense, rather than just a pure curiosity hook. But what we do use for the curiosity hook is the cover for the actual
thumbnail.
The thumbnail, that's it. So there we can go all out, because that's not a searchable thing. That's going to be a very visual, attention-grabbing thing. And then the description itself is a little bit more driven by YouTube keywords.
Got it.
So that is the difference between the player description, podcast description, and the YouTube description. And then you asked about show notes. So show notes is very much based on Google. So then a similar process, right? So Capsho has created all of the show notes for me. I take a look at it. In the meantime, while that's happening, our team member will then do SEO research on Google. With some topics, YouTube and Google are very similar. In other topics, it's a bit of a difference. So in terms of some of the longer tail keywords, so and then we'll take another look and say, okay, what do we need to tweak here to make sure that it's now SEO, it's been optimized for Google. So there might be some slight tweaks. So I can drop an example of that as well.
Yes.
So that's how, it's just a bit of optimization.
And you can see why we say only do this if you have the time, or you have a team that has time, because there is a little bit more finessing in all of this. We are very, if you listen to the episode on the podcast ROI Killer, you would know that we are very, very intentional with every platform that we're on. We want to be using it to its fullest capability, for its audience, for what the platform is built for. And you can see that we're doing the same thing even with YouTube and Google. We actually have we do different keyword research based on that platform, which I know a lot of people don't do. But that's, it's important, right? If you're going to use a platform, if you're going to be on there. Exactly.
And I think I have to say that would have been for our team and my time kind of impossible if we didn't already have such a draft. So obviously when we were writing them from scratch, would not have had the time and capacity. We probably have deprioritized this. But when you've already got a really good draft and you know what the keywords are, then it's just a matter of, I shouldn't say just, but it's a matter of then looking up the keywords and doing that additional work on top of the work that Capsho has already done for you.
And we want to make sure that in the description of our of the podcast YouTube channel, that we do want to be linking it back to our main channel.
Yes.
To your point before, where then people can actually make that link to be like, oh, okay, this is actually linked to Deidre Shen.
Yes.
And the link is actually there, so they can go and just click on that to see what other content we're creating.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing is, yes, you want to be on YouTube because it's got great search capability. The second thing is to be on YouTube for your podcast, create a separate account for it and just name it the same as your podcast name. So I have a YouTube channel that's called Grow My Podcast Show, which is just literally just houses these podcast episodes. And then I have a separate, my own branded account, Deidre Shen Capsho account, which is more tighter how-tos that go in there. Okay, so that's the second thing, right? Create a separate account for your podcast. So the third thing then, let's talk about what do we want to do on both accounts, right? Because again, if you listen to that Podcast ROI Killer episode, I talk about that we are not about repurposing. We're all about reconcepting.
Yes.
That's not to say that you can't actually use the content that you create. You can't reuse that, but we just want you to think a little bit differently about how you use it. So, for example, for us, we put just this whole podcast episode on the Grow My Podcast Show channel.
Yes.
And we just create an audiogram and it just plays. It's searchable. We've done all the research. We've linked it back to my main channel. So that's all set up.
Yeah.
By the way, just to, as an aside, just to prove about, when we say people don't watch podcast episodes on YouTube, I had a look at the stats and I think the average viewership was something like 3 minutes on these episodes, on the Grow My Podcast Show videos. Anyway, so there's that, unless people just don't see value in any of these podcast episodes that we do. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then we go to your main branded account, if you have one. Now, again, if you don't have the time to be doing this, and this bit is probably not for you. But I did want to call this out just for those who are on YouTube as your brand and you're thinking about potentially setting up another account for your podcast.
Yeah.
So what I do personally is I actually still reuse this content, what I'm talking about, but I only hone in on the bits where I'm sharing value or tips.
Yes.
Right? Because again, YouTube, that's what people go onto YouTube for, right? They just want to get to the point. It's like, I don't have all this time, just give me the things really quickly.
Yeah.
And so that's what I actually use on the YouTube videos.
Like in this particular example for this episode, it would be these 3 things that we're just discussing. That's clipped in nice and tight.
Yes.
For people to find their exact answer, hopefully very quickly.
Yes, exactly. And you want to be using the description. Can you talk us through how we come up with the descriptions and almost like how we link? Because it can be a little bit of a maze, right? To go, obviously with the podcast channel, you want to link it back to your main channel. From the main channel, we want to be going to your show, still pushing people to your show notes,
Yes.
to your website, all those things. Can you talk through how we build the maze?
Yeah. And YouTube descriptions are one of those ones, because I know there's usually a bit of a, with everything on when you're posting, just have the one call to action. And that is absolutely true, especially of the more demand-based platforms where people's attention is very, very, and you just want to focus on the one thing, just the next step. A YouTube audience is slightly different. So this is one where people are researching, they're perusing, they probably have their laptops up and they're really diving deep into this particular thing and more likely to binge, as we know that, YouTube does a very good job of like, here's the next video and then, would you like this? So they are in that mode already. And this is always up for experimentation, but we, with our descriptions for the Deidre Shen and Capsho channel, what we do is we still want the description to be very specific to the topic being discussed, especially so because it's such a tight video, as you say, 5-10 minutes, getting straight to the point. And we want that description, that first couple of lines to be, this is exactly what you're going to get from it. And we do tighten those up a little bit because it's more about like, again, we know this person has clicked through because they're looking for a very specific answer. This is what you're going to get, bang, just hit play.
Yeah.
And then what you find, and I'm sure, I don't know if you're on YouTube very much as a user, is if it's good, then you're like, what else does this person have? And then so what we do is if there's, we always have for our value tips, well, most of the time, I think 95% of the time we have, we have a lead magnet or we have an additional value that we are adding. So similarly, we'll just say, this is where you can get that.
Yes.
And what was mentioned in the episode or this particular part of the video. And then we have, like you say, the calls to action to actually engage with us more.
Yes.
So in your case, we have obviously the show notes, so I should say our podcast website, where we actually host all of the more fully formed content for our episodes. And then we also say, here's, where you can find, connect with me more personally. So that's where all of your social links and your website can go. So as someone who's an expert who teaches other people these things, that is also what people are looking for, because chances are, especially if they found you cold, they found you from a very much a keyword search to say, I'm looking for this exact solution, and they really like what you're saying. And the next thing before they start to consume more of your content, they're going to want to know who this person is.
Yes.
So that's the thing you have to balance, especially as an expert who's podcasting. People that already know you are probably going to be, trying to get to your website in other ways or follow you on social media and things like that already. So that's how so we kind of have those two sections. The top part of the description, it is a bit longer on the Deidre Shen and Capsho channel, the branded channel, I should say, is very much to do with the video that they just watched. And the second half, if you will, is more about the person behind the brand.
Yes, love that. Okay, so those are the three tips that we have to answer the question of should your podcast be on YouTube. The first is yes, if you have the time, okay, because it is a powerful search engine. So that's the first thing. The second thing is if you already have a channel on YouTube, create a separate account for your podcast, because it doesn't get a lot of views on YouTube. So you want it there for the visibility and for the searchability, but go into it not expecting that people will actually listen to your podcast on YouTube.
Yes.
So don't penalize your main brand account with that. Okay. And then the third thing is, what do you do? So on your podcast channel, you can just do an audiogram, post your whole podcast episode on there. On your main branded account, you want to tighten it up, only focus on the values, the tips that you share. And obviously Bonner went into a ton of detail around what you put in your descriptions. The comments if you learned something new in this video, and if you want to hear the full story behind how I stumbled upon this particular secret, then listen to episode 14 of the Grow My Podcast show. I'll leave the link below. Check this video out if you want to learn about the traffic pyramid, the exact strategy on how I've grown my podcast audience, and it's only 4 steps. And then this one, if you want my exact process that'll set you up to get maximum ROI on the next live event that you attend.